All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Standard Bank webinar, this time on a topic which I'm finding fascinating, ethical AI. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about exactly what I hope to cover on that in a minute. Just while you're joining, though, I really want to stress that if you haven't been on one of these calls before, I like to try to make it as interactive as possible. So if you do have questions, I've opened up the chat so you can pop them in there, or you can raise it as a Q&A. And if it's a particularly good question, who knows, maybe we even call you up onto the panel so you can ask the question and get directly engaged with Kerryn. With that, let's introduce Kerryn. A very warm welcome to you. Hi, how are you?
Hi, Colin. Very well, thanks. And thanks very much for having me here today.
Lovely. Now, I'm in Joburg. Where are you dialing in from?
So I'm dialing in from London, a slightly murky and grey London today.
Okay, well, that's basically the case every single day in London, so we don't need to go through the weather news. I'm not going to give you the comparative here. Yeah, very warm welcome. Now, as your intro, you're the head of legal and digital innovation for Standard Bank, legal by trade, working in the financial sector. How have you ended up in this position of being interested and now being effectively the head of ethics when it comes to artificial intelligence? That's the first part of the question. And then the second part of the question we want to get into is exactly what is ethical AI and ethical AI frameworks. But let's start with the first part. This is a new area that didn't exist 2 or 3 years ago, and now you'll find it. What was the progression to get into that space?
Thanks, Colin. So it was a little bit of luck and a little bit of planning, I suppose. So I've had a fairly varied career across financial services. And so I started developing an interest in AI and tech a long time ago. And as that field grew and I got more and more interested, I was lucky enough to have a boss who was quite forward thinking. And when I approached him on this idea of starting up a new area for legal in the bank, he said, sure, let's give it a go. He said, I'm not sure if there's any legs in it, but let's give it a go. So it all really took off from there. And that was the kickoff point. And then Standard Bank morphed into more of a platform business strategy. And since then, we've moved slightly away from that, on now incorporating digital and AI and tech into how we deliver banking. But yeah, it gave me some great opportunities to be exposed to AI and to technology. So that's really where it came from.
Well, why did you do that? I mean, you're obviously very curious and you're engaging with AI and going on heaps of courses that only really intelligent people like you could go on. And something's obviously spurred you as you're going through that to say there's some sort of risk or issue here that needs to be looked at, particularly from a Standard Bank perspective. What was the thought process there that you identified?
Yeah, so Colin, I think it's really as you start to get to grips with tech, and I think this is an important point, right? You can't be in this field without actually understanding a little bit about the technology and what underlies it. Otherwise, you don't really understand the risks. And the more I started to look at it, and the more you see the opportunity and the use case for AI in the bank, and we'll hopefully get into that in a little bit later. The more you engage with that, the more you realize that actually there's significant opportunity. It's a super exciting time to be in the space, right? I don't think, and this is definitely not going to be a talk about ChatGPT and generative AI only, but as we sit in the space and as this field explodes, it's an incredibly exciting time to be involved. But it's also a space where we don't know what we don't know. We don't know how things are evolving. And I think that's in part why this deep interest in ethics and in AI ethics was sparked, because I think sometimes we don't even understand, we don't understand the risks we're running, and we don't understand the importance of taking an ethical lens to AI and to the technology we're using.
Let's start by describing that. What is this whole field of ethical AI?
So I think let's first start maybe by looking at what is ethics itself. And it can be a little bit confusing because ethics and the law are quite closely linked. But actually, ethics is really about what is good or bad, what is morally good or morally bad. And sometimes that's supported by the law. But the really interesting thing about ethics, and the reason that this is such a tricky space to be in, is that there's no right or wrong answer in ethics. So sometimes there's very clearly an unethical answer, but very often we've got absolutely no 100% correct or 100% incorrect answer, and we land up in this kind of gray space with ethics. And so that makes it quite challenging when you're trying to say, well, how do ethics and AI fit together? And I think one of the ways we can
give us an example of that, Kerryn. I think that's a fascinating point. Give us an example of that.
So here's an interesting example, right? And I think, Colin, I'm going to ask you if you're able to run a little poll for the people who are on the call, and we can do a quick show of hands on this. But here's a way to think about ethics and why there's no black or white answer. And for those of you who've been to one of the business schools or studied ethics and philosophy, forgive me and just bear with me, but it is an interesting use case to think about how it plays out in real life. So if we took an example where we've got a train driver and he's going down a track, and the track veers and branches off, and if he keeps going straight, there's 5 bodies that have been tied to the train track in front of the train driver, and the train is going to kill all 5 people if it hits them. If the train veers off to the left, there's 1 body that's tied to the track, and the train's going to kill the 1 body. And you are the person who's standing at that intersection with a little lever. And if you pull the lever, the train's going to go left, and the train is then going to hit just the 1 person who is going to die. We know that person's going to die. If you don't pull that lever, the train is going to continue going straight, and it's going to kill all 5 people. So the question I've got for you, and there's no right or wrong answer here, is, do you pull the lever or don't you pull the lever? So maybe if everyone can just quickly put their thoughts into that.
I'm not putting my thoughts into it. I'm sure there's a right answer.
We can't see who said what.
You'll be able to when I end the poll, but at the moment we've got a lot of you've clearly described it in a way. We're not getting a balanced outcome here, Kerryn.
You never do. But we should get a slightly mixed outcome, hopefully.
While they're just doing that, tell us the answer.
Well, there is actually no answer, right? And so what this illustrates is both of these outcomes have 2 ethically correct outcomes, depending on which, so that's about right. That's about a usual percentage. So they both have what are considered to be ethically correct outcomes, depending on which field of ethics resonates with you. So the people who said they were going to pull the lever and redirect the train, those people would fall into something we call consequentialist ethics, which is you're worried about the consequences of things, and the thing which has the best consequences or the best outcome for the most people, that's the right thing to do. So people who voted along that field would have probably had that in mind. The people who said they wouldn't pull the lever are the people who believe that they do not want to be involved in a direct action of theirs that causes a harm to somebody else, right? So these are people who are more, their own core values are what drive their ethics rather than the outcome. And one way to think about this, and we don't have another poll running, but one way to think about this for the people who answered they would pull the lever, is if I change the story slightly and I said, now you've got a guy on top of a bridge, and if you push him off the bridge, he's going to stop the train, and he's going to stop the train running into the 5 people. Would you push the guy? And now suddenly, the typical things that a whole lot of people who answered they were okay to pull the lever and kill someone down the track because they were saving 5 people. When it becomes a far more personal case of now you actually have to push someone off that bridge, the answer changes slightly again, and you get normally another 50-50 split. So it's just a useful way to think about ethics, and when you think about it in this construct, you understand why it's so hard to say, well, is this AI ethical? Because under whose ethics? How? Who decides that? How do you implement it? And this is why it's, people kind of glibly say, oh, ethical AI, but that's why it's actually quite a tricky thing to implement. And so what we're seeing happening over the last few months.
I understand this from like a Tesla, for example, because this is, very much a life and death choice. And they've been having this battle for years now. Do you design the car so that it
Yes.
protects the passengers, or does it protect the people in front? And does it change if it's an old couple or a lady with a baby going across a zebra crossing, as opposed to, three gangsters? So they've been running those simulations and
Mm.
discussions for years now, and it's not clear to me what they've decided. Then you get to the next level. Who is actually at fault? Is it the car manufacturer? Was it the software provider that gave you the AI? Was it the people that took the input data? There's so many different facets to it. What about in the normal company, though? Is this a bit extreme, or are we still facing potentially the balancing of different risks and opportunities and benefits from AI?
Yeah, so it's a great question, Colin, and it is extreme in the instance of probably your typical company that we see today. But I think it also depends pretty much on the industry you're in, because the AI and the applications we're seeing in healthcare could have far more extreme implications for people than the AI we're possibly seeing today in financial services, for example. But I think you can't also underestimate sometimes how a very simple algorithm or a simple piece of AI can have a negative and significant impact on people. So, for example, if you were using AI to decide on a lending algorithm, so who am I going to lend money to? And you were looking at, I don't know, you were looking at lending this money out into not your, maybe a more rural environment where you were giving people access to base money just to get fees to pay school fee, money to pay school fees or those kind of things. If you've got the wrong algorithm and you've got data that isn't accurate and you've got biased outcomes in that data, the people you decide to lend money to or don't lend money to, I mean, that can have a direct impact on that person's life. That can mean that person somewhere in the middle of nowhere can't get their child to a hospital when they need to because they don't have the fare. So, I mean, I'm taking a little bit to the extreme, but I'm just saying we need to think about everything we do impacts human lives on the other side of it. And so sometimes what we think is a fairly innocuous type of AI or something, well, we lend to them, we don't lend to them, it doesn't really matter. That can actually have, for the real life people on the other side, fairly significant consequences. So, yeah,
I
take
think
the
that's a
point.
very good example.
But
I think that's an excellent example. And it's such a good example because we faced that situation pre-AI as well. So sitting here in South Africa, a lot of this audience are going to be based in South Africa. We know that there is a huge need to democratize access to finance across the 50 million people living in South Africa. There's huge ethical issues there because it's just too expensive. It's too complicated. There's 20 million people there that could really benefit from free finance. And we've seen this last couple of years as well. There's lots of evidence that shows that those old-fashioned scorecards that banks used were completely useless. Just because you don't have a proof of address, that doesn't mean that you're a bad credit. Just because you don't have your details in a credit scoring agency like an XDS or whoever it might be, doesn't mean that you're a bad credit. And yet this has already been a bias that's been there for decades. And now we're just going into this new world where AI is offering us huge opportunities to serve that market. And like you said, huge opportunities to completely mess up and still be incredibly biased and unethical. And my question is, how are you going about trying to go and deal with this incredibly complex type issue? Because there's so many parties and stakeholders that want to get into this discussion.
yeah, Colin, it is. It's extremely tricky. So, and I think the first thing people have got to, the first sort of step to all of this is you've got to understand the landscape of the organization that you're in. So what does that landscape look like? And I think the days of saying, well, our IT and our tech teams understand what technology and what AI we use, those days they're long gone. We can't exist in a world like that anymore. Similarly, our super smart data scientists, and I think our John will be on in a couple of weeks, I think, talking a little bit more about our data science and AI. But we can't also rely solely on the data science team to do this. So part of what we need to do is to try and understand what our landscape looks like. What is the AI that we've got in our organization look like? And really significantly, what is the data? What is the data in our AI in our organization look like? And there's two pieces to that, because the one aspect as well is the data legitimate and have we collected it correctly, which hopefully the answer is yes to all of that. But then the second question is, what hidden biases are in that data? Is there dogmatism in that data? What happens when we process and collect it and use it differently? So all of these things, before you can even start, you have to understand what that landscape looks like and what your organization looks like. And then the next step is to try and work out what people you've got. And obviously in a bigger organization, you will have access to a more diverse team. If you're a smaller startup, it can be a little tricky. And I've seen a lot of the startups actually calling in outside advisors to help them, to help them work out. Often they've got fewer products, but they've got less people. So then it's working out what are the roles and responsibilities of everyone in this journey. And the point is, with this thing, it's not one person's role and it's not one person's responsibility. It's got to permeate. It's got to permeate what you do. So any division using AI to run a platform, to put things out there, running AI in the background, using generative AI, all of those players have got to be thinking about this and thinking about what the impact is and what the ecosystem looks like that they're playing in.
You make it sound, well, let's rephrase that. It sounds, no matter who's ever explained this, it sounds incredibly complex and difficult to go and think through this. But you're putting it in a very positive way, in the sense that we're expecting organizations to go through this type of thought process. What's the reality on the ground? Is this something that organizations are already working hard on and trying to be ethical and put processes and structures in place? Or is it the Wild West still for the majority and we need some nudges to move them in the right direction?
So it's a great question, Colin. I think most organizations, and certainly most big organizations, have got some kind of ethical framework, right? They realize that ethics are important.
And by most, you're talking about usually listed organizations.
Yes, yeah. But what we're talking about now is your general organizational ethical framework isn't enough. And just to answer your question properly, I think there are very few companies to date who've actually built out an ethical framework. So the positive side is that in the last year and a half since I've been looking at this, there are far more guidelines available now, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but there are far more resources and tools available. People are starting to surface a little bit better what does this actually mean and how do you practically implement it. But to be honest, I have not seen companies are starting to think about it and they're starting to worry about it. I haven't seen many companies implement them yet because it's complex and because it's hard. And it requires a completely different way of thinking from the top down. You can't have someone at the bottom driving this. You can't just have your data scientist team driving this. It's really got to be an organizational shift, I think.
Do you think this is going to happen organically? Boards and leadership teams are going to actually realize that this is a significant risk if they get it wrong, and it's a significant benefit to actually do it, look at it on the positive side? Or do you think we need regulators and governments to start stepping in and forcing organizations, big and small, to follow standards, ISO standards, other acts that are coming out, the European Artificial Intelligence Act and other global regulation that's being pushed through?
Yeah, so Colin, I think there's a mix in there, right? We're definitely seeing more thought going into it from boards, and boards are concerned about it. And certainly if I look at the number of people who are approaching me to say, can you come and advise the board on what you think, what do we need to do? How do we need to start? There's definitely an uptick in what people are thinking about. So that for sure is happening. The cynic in me says, if we look historically at regulation, it sometimes forces people down a path. So will people go down that path without regulation? I'm not sure. The risk, of course, is even if the regulation comes, and we've seen the number of fines and the number of things that are going on into the big platforms and these big companies that are using quite developed AI, and probably a more advanced way than some companies. They find ways to circumvent the legislation as well. And then what happens? You get whacked with a fine, and so you kind of land up in a spiral there. So it's probably my thoughts on it is probably a combination of both. It's probably useful to have some kind of regulation that sets things out, but at the same time, you don't want to be completely prescriptive. If you put in a set of standards that every company has to adhere to, you kill innovation. So you actually then stop the small startup altogether from making something amazing with AI. So there's a really tricky balance there between, and this is why the EU AI Act came under a lot of fire, because people are saying, well, you're just going to kill innovation. And it's why Britain, on the other hand, has taken a view, well, we in the UK are rather going to take a risk-based approach, and we're going to go in by segments, and we want to be pro-innovation. So I think it's also top of mind for regulators. They're very aware that if they're too prescriptive, you could kill everything, but at the same time, they're terrified of, and probably rightly so, of what could come. A really difficult time, because we actually don't know where the AI is going, and we don't know what it's going to do.
Which is a scary thought. Let's put you on the spot.
Yeah.
Good question from Abdullah. Hey, Abdullah, I hope you're well, by the way. We'll see you in a couple of weeks, I hope. I'll email you separate. Anyway, going off topic. So while also ensure, how do you go and get this AI for efficiency and productivity sorted out on these frameworks? Obviously, you've just touched on it a little bit, that you've got to make sure that the concerns are addressed in organizations. You don't want to go down that slippery slope where you start stifling innovation and actually becoming preventative for your organization's very ability to survive, because the competition's moving ahead. But you also can't go too far the other way, where it comes to light perhaps in future years it wasn't intentional today, but you find out it was unethical, it was biased, the data was inaccurate, it did lead to huge bias in how you're dealing with people. You weren't able to delete people's data because once it's in the algorithm and the algorithm is trained, there's no way to go and reverse that, because you don't know exactly how it works, and all the myriad of other issues that can come through. So how do you set that up to get that balance? And have you got any great examples at Standard Bank? I think it's a good question there from. Thanks, mate.
So it's a great question, and it is really hard to get the balance. So part of what we've done at Standard Bank, which might help bigger organizations if you're trying to look at deploy one of these framework, is to start in an incubated environment, because that enables you, and by that I mean pick one place where you can test this framework and you can get input, and you can get the right people around the table, the right mix of people, because that's pretty important here as well. You don't want a bunch of risk-averse lawyers. Similarly, you don't want a bunch of ONI. You don't want a bunch of ONI data scientists. You don't want a bunch of, so you really want a nice mix of people who are coming with different lenses, different ideas, different views on what can make things work in the organization, and different views on what can cause you to fail. And then I think to incubate that in a smaller space and to test what you're doing is pretty useful. And then to test it against technology. So we are at the moment developing we're using an AI nudging technology, right? And I'm just using that as a small example, but you can then use that to start to test your framework against. And you want to work out, it's a great question, because if I say to you, my AI needs to be fair, what does that mean in practice? How do you test that? How do you work that out? And so these are the kind of things you can work out. Well, in this context, it means X or Y, and then you can start building out something around that. And ultimately, where you're trying to get to is something that's measurable. And Colin, you raised an interesting point there around, how do we make sure that we're staying on track, and we're staying within the kind of boundaries where we need to be in, without totally veering off piste. And I think these are just useful ways to come in and sense check yourself, and measure whether what you're doing is actually practical before you scale it to a whole organization. So that model won't work everywhere. It won't work in smaller startups, but sometimes it's a good way to get something in and to start changing a culture and a mindset without throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
It feels to me that this is something which is sometimes quite ethereal. when I think about, particularly in regulated industries, let's do a comparative to privacy legislation with papaya and the equivalents across the globe, GDPR and everything else. Those are quite easy to think about because they're very specific. Store the data, make sure it's safe, don't let it be there be a breach, give people the right to delete their data, give people access to data. Those were quite, in theory, at the time it seemed quite difficult, but technology's caught up. Some organizations might have some difficulties because they don't really know where they store their data, but many are getting to grips with that. When we come to the algorithms that you're using in machine learning and AI, we don't really know how they work. And so how do we expect this to progress? Are there going to be auditors that are coming in who over time are going to be able to say directly that, no, this is a good algorithm. You have you've clearly put a lot of thought into your data and training processes. We're very comfortable that the outputs are not biased from the way that you've built these particular pieces. And then even more ethereal, and we think you've got fairness just right. We think you're a very fairly minded organization. Where's this going?
Yeah, so Colin, I think you raise a couple of interesting points in there, right? And the one is that I think we mustn't think about these frameworks certainly as delivering only an auditable right or wrong response, because the one thing we know about AI is that bias is there. There are problems there. It's not always transparent. There's not always sufficient human in the loop. There's a myriad where you just have to Google AI bias and you'll see a million things come up. So the one thing that we know is that when we deploy this AI, it's not always going to be right. So I think people need to think about these frameworks as a way to fix problems. And that's why when we talk about these frameworks, they're always iterative. You look at the language that the EU artificial intelligence high-level expert group uses. All of them will talk about this. The Turing Institute, the Ethics Institute in Australia, they all talk about this iterative idea because we don't know what AI is going to do. And certainly the one thing we do know with AI is you can deploy it for one use case, and then suddenly, before you know it, you're using it somewhere else in a completely different context that was never envisaged. The other challenge you've got, obviously, is when you're using AI in a deep learning model and not necessarily using supervised learning, you don't know what the machine is going to do. You don't know what correlations it's going to make. You don't know what it's going to spit out. You don't actually always know how it's going to behave. And I think as AI progresses and as this becomes more and more embedded into business, this is going to become a more and more realistic and challenging problem. So I think there's two points in that. One is that you've got to look at this thing as a way to say, how do I keep checking myself and check that I'm on track? And so that when I'm not on track, I know where to adjust. So that's the one piece. How do I know what to do? And the second piece is I actually think with time, these frameworks will become easier. And the way data privacy has landed up, it won't be exactly the same, but there will be some clearer ideas on metrics and ways to measure whether something is fair or not fair. Remembering, of course, that fairness is subjective. And also remembering that if I am in the UK, I might have a very different view of fairness to some technology or AI that's built in China, or some technology and AI that's built in Africa, where there's a different cultural ethical norm that dictates what I think is fair or transparent or human in the loop or whatever your various ethical things are. So I do think they will become more mainstream. I think they'll become easier. And I think what people will be checking from an auditing perspective is, do you have the guardrails there? An auditor's not going to be able to necessarily tell you this is fair or this isn't fair. But if you can show, well, we've got this, it's kind of delivering results we would have expected, or delivered results we really didn't expect, so we investigated and we think we know why and we're comfortable with that, then I think that's where you want to get to, right? I'm not sure that anyone can subjectively opine on these very ethereal concepts.
This sounds like it's going to get very messy, particularly for large multinational organizations. I was just thinking this through as you're talking there. I mean, let's take an example where you're a large multinational, you've got a subsidiary or branch that's in the US, maybe California, you've got another one in South Africa, another in London, each with very different legislation related to privacy is one thing, but obviously AI, as that starts to come on stream. And one classic example is web scraping. So in San Francisco, no problems at all. It's public data. Take the information, load it up into your model, train your algorithm, and everything's really cool, because if it's on the web, it's open for all. If you go and look in parts of Europe and other parts of the world, that's definitely not the case. You're not allowed to just go and simply ingest data, no matter how public it is. And now you've got other aspects where individual websites have got disclosures on there which you haven't followed. So there's this kind of desire across the globe to go and ingest huge amounts of data to train models, and yet we haven't even got a structure in place where the rules are the same. And actually, when you think about it, we don't even know where that data on the web came from, to be honest. So which legislation deals with that? How on earth do we manage that? I mean, it feels like courts are going to be busy for decades.
Yeah, Colin, that's always a job for the lawyers, right? They've always got a job wherever these things land up. But no, in all seriousness, you raise one of the biggest issues that people are grappling with. So when you talk to people who are working on AI governance and working on AI ethics frameworks, and the ultimate goal would be to have a sort of universal set of principles that apply. And that's just not going to happen. Certainly not in the foreseeable future. So what you will probably find happening is companies defaulting, which is what people are really worried about, to some of the lowest common denominator legislation. So if I take, for example, not that I'm calling this lowest common denominator legislation, but if you take data privacy, what you'll find is a lot of companies have just defaulted to GDPR because then they know they're kind of safe in all jurisdictions. Or if they're looking at data scraping, they'll follow the most conservative approach. And there's a danger, there's a benefit in that because it's less risky, but there's also a danger that you lose some of that innovation and you lose some of that that local nuance that you've got. And that's obviously, that's the $1 million question, Colin. If you can work out the answer to that, I think you would have solved a lot of problems.
Now the questions are starting to come, and these aren't easy questions. I promised I'd protect my light. So let's start with Manette. Say, Manette. I was just going to read it. So for a company like SBSA with its global footprint, doesn't this put you in a precarious position? As just stated, fairness is in the eye of the beholder. How are you going to enforce and sell a group position when your staff collectively in lots of different countries, you've got geographical presence across, I don't know, what is it, 15, 16 African countries at least. But anyway, collective one country believe their ethics to be right, and that's not aligned to what you're sitting with in Standard Bank SA or London, for example. This is going to be tricky for companies in general who've got multiple, domains in lots of different geographies.
It is tricky, but I think in some ways we don't want to overstate the problem. So it's not something new. So any company that's operating in multiple jurisdictions is already facing multiple challenges on where do you put that balance between headquarters and in country. And I think the answer probably lies in a blended approach. So there's some principles, like when you think about, is my AI fair, or whatever it is that you're talking about, those principles I think are probably not that difficult to align on a very high level. Where the challenge is going to come in is when you've got localized AI being developed or whatever, that hierarchy of how, because remember, your AI principles, and I mean, most of the models have got around 3 or 4 values and 5 or 6 principles that underpin this. The values being the very broad objectives of what you're trying to do with your AI, and the principles being the more specific stuff. So I think what you need to then do is contextualize each use case, and you need to look at every instance of AI on its own, and then you're going to have to work out that hierarchy. So in some instances, and this is for lawyers on the call, this is no different to human rights and how you balance human rights. In COVID, we had to balance privacy against right to life, against all of these things, and you come up with what you hope is the right balance in the end. And this is the same thing. So we're going to have to take each, you need to think about this AI ethics as a framework that sits over the thing with flexibility, so that you can take each instance of your AI and then work out in that instance which value might take precedence over another value in that particular use case, because you will have times when it's more important to be transparent than something else, or you will have times where it's less important to have human in the loop because the risk assessment of that AI is lower. So I think the way we don't want to, you can get caught up in this idea of, oh my word, how are we ever gonna deploy something that makes sense for everyone? But Standard Bank as an organization already has a very strong ethics framework, and that ethics framework applies to the whole organization. So this is just about not panicking, but leveling it out for AI so that we are asking the right questions and thinking about the right things on a case-by-case basis.
Two structural questions. Yeah, I think it's the best answer I've heard on something which is incredibly complicated. There's common sense and maneuvering through this, but as you say, we're not talking solid lines here. There's lots of areas of grey, which is, I suppose, unsurprising because in many ways, as people say, AI is very similar to human. And we're not particularly great at walking. We're going to come back to that in a minute, though. Rob Jackson, many organizations are silo-based. Is it essential to create an integrated organization? Great question.
A framework for so AI in an integrated way across the organization. Yeah, that's a great question, right? And I think it very much depends on your organization and what it's doing. My gut feel is that you're better off having a single set of values and a single set of frameworks. Again, going back to that question that came before, that you can then use in your silos if you're not, if you are siloed. I think the risk with silos as well, though, right, is AI is going to break down some of those risks. And what's going to happen is that people are sometimes less siloed than you think. So depending on how and this is a starting point, right? Because you're going to define, each organization actually needs to work out what it means by AI. And surprisingly, there are quite a few definitions of what AI is out there. So I would advocate going for quite a broad definition of AI, and then working out in terms of risk, how you want to apply your framework to that. But your AI is probably not going to be deployed always in a siloed way. So I think there's a danger, and this is just my own personal view. I think there's a danger in trying to make a very siloed approach, because your organization could land up with treating the same piece of AI differently and in a different risk way through different parts of the organization. So I would rather look to each use case with a single framework.
When I think about AI, it reminds me of humans. Reminds me, and I think about the way that we think about, particularly generative AI. And you think, what is, use myself as an example, how am I going to be driving in the next hour after this particular call? How am I going to behave in the next meeting? What am I going to say to these different people? What am I going to do in terms of savings and investments? What am I going to do to prevent myself from committing some sort of crime? And if I think forward, I basically think I'm some sort of very basic biological version of AI where I don't 100% know what's going to happen in the future, but there's clearly a process the brain goes through which kind of starts here, and we've had all these inputs. I've learned stuff, I've experienced stuff, I've compared myself to others, I've been told things I can and I can't do, and now I'm looking forward and I don't have to think too hard. Hopefully, roughly, I sort of maneuver my way through as a reasonably honest human being. Let's use that as a term. I'm managed in that sense, not by one piece of legislation. There are thousands of different pieces of legislation out there which are meant to pull me up if I do and do something wrong, which have thought about ethics and thought about the impact on society. I wonder if in the AI space we need definitive AI legislation, or whether the existing legislation is actually enough because it's just essentially a variation of what I've described.
Yeah, Colin, so this, I think, highlights the difference in approach that, for example, the EU and the UK have taken. So the EU have gone, well, we need a piece of legislation for AI, and they have delivered the world's first AI-specific encompassing legislation. So we've had bits and pieces in China on certain aspects of AI, but they've developed the first all-encompassing AI-related legislation. The UK, on the other hand, have said, well, we are not going to do that in their white paper. We are going to rather leave it to our pillars, so our existing regulators, and this kind of goes to what you're saying, Colin, to work out where we need to add to their remit, so whether it's Ofcom or whoever it is, what do they need to do in their remit to take account of AI, and how do we need to think about that? So there's two things in there. One is I think people make a mistake in saying they look at the EU AI Act and they say, okay, well, I'm low risk, so my AI isn't legislated. That's completely not true. To the point that you raised, there's a myriad of other pieces of legislation that will catch certain behaviors from AI and things that our companies are doing. So just because you don't fall squarely within the legislation doesn't mean you are now kind of free to do what you want. So you're definitely still caught in that net. The danger of not, so that's the kind of downside to the AI legislation, and people are worried that's too prescriptive and it's going to mess with innovation. And that's actually, I mean, if you look at what they had to do with the EU Act, they had to rewrite that act when generative AI came out, because in that time between having published it and ChatGPT being released, they suddenly realized, oh my word, we haven't catered for a whole host of things that are now suddenly very real. So that's kind of the risk of trying to regulate something that you don't know where it's going, right? The risk of not putting any regulation in place and going on a piecemeal basis is we could land up in a situation where things are treated very differently in healthcare to how they're treated in, I don't know, general data, to how they're treated in on platforms, to how they're, depending on which minister's remit they fall under and what people perceive a risk to be. So you could end up with quite a disjointed approach there. And I don't think, and I think this is part of the reason we haven't yet, it's taken so long to even get to this point, is nobody actually knows what the best approach is to do here. And yes, AI definitely has regulation in existing pieces of regulation. We can probably, as time goes on, build that regulation out. The real issue with regulation, though, is regulation in its typical form looks back. So if you look at what they've done in financial services, you look at what they've done in healthcare, you look at everything, it's backward looking. They look at the risks that have happened and they say, oh, this has happened, we need to cater for this in the next draft or the next revision, or we need a new piece of legislation. And it doesn't really work with AI because it's moving so fast, you can never catch up. So that's the real conundrum of how you properly start to regulate the space. And I think why nobody's got a great answer yet. And there's a Colin Ridge dilemma, which the data scientists here will know about. And it's that point where if you regulate too soon, you stop things from happening and you can't anticipate where it's going. But if you regulate too late, people are already doing stuff and they're already involved in stuff and you can't change that behavior. So where do you find that fine balance? And I don't know, these are all questions I definitely don't have the answers to. Just more questions.
Well, yeah, we've got 2 minutes. So I think Nanda's question, maybe we move that onto the next session. This was understanding the parameters and considerations that are incorporated into the training data. I think that's probably a good one, Nanda, for the 2nd of August, because then we've got the next One Hub Insider conversation called Unlocking the Power of Data Science. And there we've got John Mokombaranwa. Have I pronounced his name correctly? I've got about a month to go and work that one out. And he's going to be the perfect person because he's head of digital insights, effectively the head of the AI team for CIB. So probably that's a good one to pose through to John. Rob's question I quite like, though, and maybe this is a good one because we're running out of time. Do you know what's happening in terms of the regulators in South Africa? We've obviously got lots of South Africans on this call. We know that Rishi Sunak in London wants to be the centre of virtually everything related to AI, and therefore regulation and ethics and science are going to be at the top of his list to go and fund and be behind. Well, I don't know what's happening in South Africa. Do you?
Yeah, so South Africa, there's two things, a quick answer in the time we've got left. So the one is the regulation is lagging, for sure. And just having looked at what's happened historically, I expect ultimately they will follow either the EU or the UK approach, probably. But for the moment, it's very quiet and people are watching quite closely. So there's a bit of commentary coming out. You can see some concerns, some things raised in the Competition Commission space. So there's definitely an eye on it, and some papers have been released, but there's nothing, no real traction yet. But that being said, Africa is a massive hub for innovation, right? And we are seeing a lot of innovation. And I saw a use case the other day that came out of South Africa that's gone viral with hearing aids, right? And AI and hearing aids. And so I think the innovation is still happening there, but the regulation and how we think about these things is not at a very advanced stage yet.
Kerryn, it's annoying. We've run out of time. I told you it should be an hour and not 45 minutes. Or was it you who told me that? Anyway, it's always my mistake. But I just want to thank you very much for joining. For everyone else that's dialed in, geez, it's a lot to cover in 45 minutes, but I hope you got some benefit out of it. As I said, coming up, we're going to be continuing this discussion, this time with a bit more focus around how to set up data science teams. And I don't know, maybe Kerryn will ask if you could join for a bit of that discussion as well. I think that could be quite interesting. Um, I'll be sharing all of the details on that anyway through the mailers, and this call has been recorded. So as long as Zoom does its thing, we should be able to send out a link with this recording and some notes over the next day or two. So with that, I wish everyone a fantastic Thursday, and we'll see you again in a couple of weeks. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.